This is the 28th President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, who served from 1913 to 1921. And if you watched my series on the Federal Reserve and the passage of the Federal Reserve Act, you know that Woodrow Wilson pretended to be a champion of the common person and pretended to be against the money trust. But in reality, he was almost totally funded by Wall Street. And today, you're going to find out why Mr. Wilson's handler, a man by the name of Colonel Mandel House, has been omitted from the history textbooks. First, I would like to give a quote from Woodrow Wilson. It was later in his life when he wrote a book called The New Freedom. And he said this at that time about the invisible government. An invisible empire has been set up in our nation above the forms of democracy. A power so organized, so watchful, so interlocked, so complete, and so pervasive that some of the biggest men in the United States in the fields of commerce, manufacture, and government know that they had better not speak above their breath when they speak in condemnation of this group. We vote, but we are offered only the platforms that they want, and we are allowed to vote only for the men who stand for their platform. But we get virtually nothing in return. We now realize that the machines of both major American political parties are subsidized by the same people, so it is useless to turn to either one of them for direction. This man is one of those figures who the American history textbooks forgot, or in more precise terms, omitted on purpose. Why? Colonel Mandel House was born in 1858 in Texas and was active in Texas politics. He served as an advisor to Woodrow Wilson, especially in the area of foreign affairs, but House never served in any official capacity, nor was he ever elected to public office. He functioned as Wilson's chief negotiator in Europe during the peace negotiations from 1917 to 1919, and as chief deputy for Wilson at the Paris Peace Conference. House used his money and influence to make the Texas Ku Klux Klan famous. He helped to establish the Council on Foreign Relations, which is the true government powerhouse behind U.S. foreign policy. House was instrumental in getting Woodrow Wilson elected President of the United States. He had the financial backing of the House of Rockefeller's National City Bank. House was a member of the Round Table Group, which was a secret society founded in Britain by the wealthy Cecil Rhodes, the man for whom the country of Rhodesia was named. Professor Carroll Quigley wrote about this secret organization in his book, The Anglo-American Establishment. Cecil Rhodes was behind the British movement to colonize Africa from north to south in order to procure the resources needed to sustain the massive British Empire. Rhodes made a fortune from diamond mines in South Africa, where the native population was exploited in the name of building immense wealth for Rhodes. When Rhodes died, a portion of his will designated that a large sum of money be delegated for the purpose of funding the Round Table Group. Rhodes dreamed of expanding the British Empire to the greatest extent possible, which would ideally also include bringing the United States back into the fold. Rhodes Scholars are the modern-day recipients of Rhodes's dream. Many Rhodes Scholars are high U.S. politicians like former President Bill Clinton. The secretive Round Table Group, of which Colonel Mandel House was a member, had 4 pet projects, which House hoped to bring about through his influence of Woodrow Wilson. And listen very carefully to what these pet projects of the Round Table were all about. 1. A central bank, which the United States did not have prior to the passage of the Federal Reserve Act in 1913, which House also helped to orchestrate. 2. A graduated income tax, which the United States did not have prior to the passage of the Federal Reserve Act. So the United States had no income tax law for several hundred years of its functioning until the passage of the Federal Reserve Act. And I'm sure you can probably guess that that is no coincidence. Number 3, the creation of a Central Intelligence Agency, which also did not yet exist in the United States. That won't come about till 1947. And 4, the creation of the League of Nations, which the United States subsequently never joined due to pushback from a group of senators who were against the surrendering of U.S. sovereignty to what would essentially become a world government. House, early in his career, had represented both British and American banking interests. He exercised a great deal of control over the Democratic Party, which had been out of office for nearly 50 years. House devised a strategy which made victory almost a mathematical certainty. The victories achieved by the party in the elections of 1912 and 1916 were applied to the application of his plan. The plan was to gain the vote of the foreign-born, the new immigrants for the Democratic Party. In fact, House published his plan anonymously, and the very year the secretly chosen Woodrow Wilson was publicly nominated and elected. That year, Mr. House wrote a novel called Philip Drew, Administrator. He wrote the book in only 30 days. One of the chapters of the novel was called The Making of a President. In this chapter, House creates a character, an American senator called Selwyn. Selwyn is depicted as desiring to, quote, govern the nation with an absolute hand, and yet now not be known as the directing power, end quote. Obviously, this is a self-portrait, and we see that Selwyn is none other than House. He even caused the character Selwyn to invite the man he selected as his puppet president to dine with me in my rooms at the Mandel House, an obvious reference to his own name, Edward Mandell House. Selwyn devises a nefarious scheme with another character, John Thor, who is described as the high priest of finance. The plan involves using a complete and compact organization, using the most infamous sort of deception regarding its real opinions and intentions to elect its creature to the presidency. Of course, the financing of this secret league was simple. And here's a quote from Philip Drew, Administrator. Thor's influence throughout commercial America was absolute. Thor and Selwyn selected the 1,000 millionaires that are to give each $10,000. Thor was to tell each of them that there was a matter appertaining to the general welfare of the business fraternity which needed $20,000 and that he, Thor, would put up 10 and wanted him to put up as much. There were but few men of business who did not consider themselves fortunate in being called to New York by Thor and in being asked to join him in a blind pool looking to the safeguarding of their wealth. Thor then puts the money that he accrues in different banks, paid at request by Selwyn to other banks, and from there transferred to the private bank of Selwyn's son-in-law. The results of this are, of course, that the public has absolutely no chance of figuring out where the funds came from or how they were spent. On the basis of finance, Selwyn then selects his chosen creature for the presidency. In the novel, this person is named Rockland. Of course, in real life, this is Woodrow Wilson, who is told by Selwyn that his responsibility as president will be as follows. While a president has a constitutional right to act alone, he has no moral right to act contrary to the tenets and traditions of his party, or to the advice of the party leaders, for the country accepts the candidate, the party, and the party advisors as a whole, and not severally. Rockland agrees to this supposition, and then after the election, Rockland is described in this way. Drunk with power and the adulation of sycophants, once or twice Rockland asserted himself and acted upon important matters without having first conferred with Selwyn. But after he had been bitterly assailed by Selwyn's papers, he made no further attempts at independence. He felt that he was utterly helpless in that strong man's hands, and so indeed he was. Take note that House is penning this novel in 1912, before the inauguration of Woodrow Wilson as president. In the private papers of Mr. House, written in 1926, it is recorded that House edited the presidential candidate's speeches and urged Wilson not to take the advice of anyone else. In addition, House notes that Wilson promised not to act independently in future. Another chapter in Philip Drew, Administrator, lays out the method that will be used for getting the creature elected. In a nutshell, it boils down to House's calculation that the most money and energy must be expended on the small body of voters who can sway the result. He calls this element the fluctuating 20%. Selwyn, the character in the novel, begins his nomination campaign by eliminating all states where the outcome is assured, either for his or the other party. Then his entire energy is devoted to the doubtful states upon whose votes the election would turn. All attention was to be focused upon this group, and to this end, a man for each unit was appointed both locally and nationally. The local man's job was to get all possible information about race, religion, occupation, and former party ties, and forward this to the man at the national headquarters. Each individual in the group was then targeted via literature or whatever other means was available. The strategy, of course, of the other party was to give out tons of printed matter via their state headquarters and to be given out when asked for. In turn, Selwyn's group used much less printed material, but sent it in a sealed envelope with a letter directed to a voter who had as yet not decided how to vote. By this skillful method, Rockland, the creature selected by Selwyn, was elected in 1912, and Rockland, of course, was Woodrow Wilson. The hero of the novel, Philip Drew, is a graduate of West Point and an admirer of Karl Marx. Drew is the elected leader of a mass movement at a meeting after the conspiracy of Selwyn and Thor has become known. Drew then assembles an army, defeats the government forces at a single battle, marches on Washington, and proclaims himself administrator of the Republic. His first major action, and of course President Wilson's, is to introduce a graduated income tax exempting no income whatsoever. Of course, this was one of the key principles of Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto. The next action taken by Drew is to attack Mexico and the Central American republics. He defeats them and they are reunited under the American flag. In another chapter, Canada and the British, French, and other possessions in the West Indies are brought under American domination as well. Selwyn and Philip Drew are obviously both Mr. House. Selwyn as the efficient party organizer and secret wielder of power, and Drew as the utopian dreamer, who does not know what to do with power when he gets it. At the end of the novel, the two characters who were in truth one man were merged. Selwyn, the original villain, becomes the confidant and companion of Drew. Drew is sent off on a ship bound for an unknown destination with a woman named Gloria. The novel concludes with, "Happy Gloria, happy Philip, where were they bound? Would they return?" These were the questions asked by all, but to which none could give answer. So what effect did all of this have on Woodrow Wilson? This is perhaps the most bizarre part of the story. The original Federal Reserve Board was handpicked by House, who early in his career had represented British and American banking interests. And if you return back to my videos on the passage of the Federal Reserve Act, you'll notice that these were the same conspirators who conspired at Jekyll Island in Georgia to write the piece of legislation that eventually became the Federal Reserve Act. The intimate papers of Colonel House, edited by Charles Seymour, reveals House as the unseen guardian angel of the Federal Reserve System. Mr. Seymour writes, "The Schiffs, the Warburgs, the Kahns, the Rockefellers, and the Morgans all had faith in House." Wilson was totally dependent on House for all political decisions. He was his alter ego. The president himself had written, "Mr. House is my second personality. He is my independent self. His thoughts and mine are one. If I were in his place, I would do just as he suggested." And that, my friends, is why Colonel Mandel House has been omitted from the history textbooks.